The door to the sheriff's office slammed open so hard the hinges screamed, and Ella Dalton stood in the frame with dust on her boots and murder in her eyes. "I am here to pay the debt," she said, her voice steady as a rifle barrel, though her hands shook at her sides. "Whatever my father owed your town, whatever Harlan Dalton stole or borrowed or broke, I am here to make it right." Sheriff Owen Prescott looked up from behind his desk, and something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but recognition of a kind of pain he had seen before, the kind that came wrapped in pride and stubbornness and the desperate need to fix something that had never been the fixer's fault in the first place. "Miss Dalton," he said slowly, setting down the paper in his hands, "how much did they tell you he owed?" $3,000, she said, "plus the interest that accumulated." "I have $940 saved. I sold my mother's brooch. I sold the horse I raised from a foal. I sold nearly everything I had left, and I made a deal with a man named Cutter Briggs to work off the rest in his saloon." Owen stood up from behind that desk so fast the chair scraped the floor, and the look that crossed his face was something between fury and devastation. "You made a deal with Cutter Briggs," he repeated, and his voice was dangerously quiet. "He said he would cover the remainder of the debt if I worked the tables at the Prairie Rose for 2 years, she said. "I signed a contract. I leave in 3 days. Owen crossed the room in 4 long strides and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his gray eyes, close enough that she noticed his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Miss Dalton," he said, and he spoke each word with absolute precision, "your father's debt was settled 8 months ago, paid in full, cleared from every ledger in Caldwell County, and Cutter Briggs knew that when he handed you that contract." The world tilted under Ella's feet. She had ridden 300 miles through Oklahoma territory on a borrowed mule. She had arrived in the town of Harlan's Creek, named with bitter irony, after the very man who had left her holding the wreckage of his life with her heart in her throat and her savings in a locked tin box pressed against her ribs under her coat. She had stepped through the door of the Prairie Rose Saloon and sat across a table from a man with oiled hair and cold, assessing eyes, and she had signed her name to 2 years of her life in exchange for a debt that apparently no longer existed. She had been trapped. The realization did not come gently. It came like a fist to the sternum. "He lied to me," she whispered. "He set a trap," Owen said, and his voice was no longer controlled. Something raw had broken through the surface of it, something almost desperate. "He has been running women through that place for years, Miss Dalton, and every one of them comes in thinking she has no choice. Every one of them believes the debt is real, the contract is legal, the obligation is hers to carry." He paused, and when he spoke again it was lower, more deliberate. "The debt is not yours to carry. It never was." The words landed somewhere deep in Ella's chest, in a place that had been bruised and aching for the better part of 5 years. Ever since her father had climbed onto a horse one autumn morning and ridden away from their small farm in Missouri, and never come back, leaving behind a trail of unpaid bills and broken promises, and a daughter who had spent every day since trying to pay a penance she had not earned. She stared at Sheriff Owen Prescott, this tall, serious-faced man with dust on his own coat and the weight of something unspoken behind his gray eyes, and she did not know whether to collapse with relief or burn down the Prairie Rose Saloon. She chose, in the end, to do neither. She chose to breathe. "Then I want that contract back," she said. "I am going to make certain of it," he said. "But first you need to sit down because you look like you have been riding for 3 days straight, and you probably have." "4," she admitted. He pulled the chair from beside his desk and set it in front of her with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the tension in every line of his body. And Ella Dalton sat down in the Caldwell County Sheriff's office in the town of Harlan's Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she let someone else take the weight. She had not been planning to let anyone do that. She had not been planning to feel anything at all, except the grim satisfaction of clearing an obligation. She had absolutely not been planning to notice the way Owen Prescott's hands were careful when he poured water from the pitcher on his desk and handed the cup to her, or the way he watched her drink it with an expression that she could not quite read but that made her feel inexplicably seen. She had not been planning on any of this, and yet here she was. Harlan Dalton had always had a gift for setting things in motion that were well beyond his control. It appeared that talent had outlasted him. Ella had learned of her father's death 11 months ago, in a letter from the county record's office in Caldwell County, Kansas, informing her that Harlan Dalton had died of a fever in the spring of 1881, and that she, as his only surviving kin, might want to be aware of certain outstanding obligations he had left behind in the town of Harlan's Creek. The letter had been clinical and brief. It had listed 3 names to whom her father owed money, and the total had made Ella's vision swim. She had sat at the kitchen table of the boarding house in Independence, Missouri, where she worked as a seamstress 6 days a week from before sunrise to after sunset, and she had looked at that number, and she had felt something harden inside her chest like cooling iron. She was not her father's keeper. She knew that. The law did not require her to pay his debts. She was not named in any contract he had signed. She owed nothing to the town of Harlan's Creek or to any man within it. But she was Harlan Dalton's daughter, and she had grown up hearing the word honor used like a weapon, and she could not walk away from a debt that carried her family name without at least trying to meet it. It had taken her 8 months to save what she could. It had taken her 3 more to find a buyer for her mother's brooch, a beautiful thing of worked silver that had been Margaret Dalton's wedding gift from her own mother, and which Ella had worn against her skin every day since her mother's death 12 years ago. The sale of it had felt like amputating part of herself. But she had done it, and then she had come to Kansas. And then Cutter Briggs had looked at her across that table with his cold, assessing eyes, and told her the debt was still $3,000, not a cent reduced since her father's death, and that he represented the interests of the men her father had wronged, and that he was prepared to offer her a very generous arrangement whereby she might work off the balance over a period of 2 years at the Prairie Rose. And she had signed because she had believed him, because the documents he produced had looked official and real, because she was exhausted and alone, and because the idea of leaving without having done something had been unbearable. She had signed. And then she had gone to the sheriff's office, not to report anything, not to ask for help, but simply because the county record's letter had mentioned that the sheriff could provide verification of the debts in question, and she wanted to be certain she had not miscalculated the amount. She had not expected Owen Prescott. She had not expected to be told the debt was gone. She had not expected any of this. Owen was already pulling on his coat, a worn brown canvas thing that spoke of practicality over vanity, his star pinned to the left breast, catching the afternoon light through the single dusty window of the office. He was perhaps 30 years old, perhaps a year or 2 past it, with dark hair and a jaw that suggested a lifetime of holding things in, and he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to act before hesitation could take root. "You stay here," he said. "I most certainly will not," Ella said. He looked at her. She looked back. "Then stay behind me," he said. "And do not say a word to Briggs unless I say you can. Not one word. I need you to trust me on that." "I do not even know you," she said, but she stood up and followed him to the door. He glanced back at her, and there was something in his expression that might, under different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. "You are about to," he said, and pushed the door open into the bright Kansas afternoon. The Prairie Rose Saloon occupied the largest building on the main street of Harlan's Creek, a wide 2-story structure with a painted wooden sign and windows that had been cleaned recently enough to suggest that money flowed through it without difficulty. It was mid-afternoon, and the street was busy with the ordinary commerce of a frontier town in 1882, horses at hitching posts, a freight wagon being unloaded outside the mercantile, 2 women in bonnets crossing carefully over the rutted mud near the feed store. Ella kept pace with Owen Prescott and tried to slow her heartbeat, which had decided that running would be preferable to whatever this was. She focused instead on the facts. The debt was paid. Cutter Briggs had lied to her. The contract she had signed was therefore fraudulent, obtained under false pretenses, and the law was walking beside her into the building where Briggs currently sat behind his profits, and his comfortable certainty that Ella Dalton would be too far from home and too desperate to fight back. He was about to discover that she had stumbled into the office of a man who apparently did not share that certainty. Owen pushed open the door of the Prairie Rose without knocking, and the saloon's interior swam up around them dark wood, the smell of tobacco and sawdust, a piano in the corner that was not currently being played, a bar along one wall with bottles arranged behind it in their amber rows. 3 men at a table looked up. A woman in a red dress paused on the staircase. Cutter Briggs was at the far end of the bar, speaking to the man behind it, and he turned when the door opened with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the room. He was perhaps 50, with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive clothes that were slightly too good for the territory, and when his eyes landed on Owen Prescott, the confidence shifted almost imperceptibly, tightened at the edges in a way that was not quite fear but was its close relative. "Sheriff," he said pleasantly. "Afternoon." "The contract," Owen said. Briggs tilted his head. "I am not certain what you are referring to." "Contract Miss Ella Dalton signed in this establishment this morning," Owen said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the way that very dangerous things sometimes become quiet. "I want it now. I run a legal business, Sheriff. Any contracts signed here are private agreements between consenting. Harlan Dalton's debt to the men you claim to represent was cleared in October of last year," Owen said. "I have the documentation. I have the signatures. I have the receipt from the county clerk's office." He paused. "And right now, the only thing standing between you and a fraud charge that would make running a business in this county very difficult indeed is how quickly you hand over that piece of paper." Briggs looked at Ella for the first time. Something moved behind his eyes: calculation, reassessment, the rapid revision of a plan that had just encountered an unexpected obstacle. "A misunderstanding," he said smoothly. Clearly there was some confusion about the precise status of the account. "Of course, in light of new information, the contract," Owen said again. There was a silence that lasted long enough to feel like a held breath. Then Cutter Briggs reached into the inside pocket of his coat, withdrew a folded paper, and set it on the bar. Owen picked it up without looking away from Briggs, turned, and handed it to Ella. She took it with fingers that had gone cold, unfolded it, and looked at her own signature at the bottom, her careful, deliberate handwriting, the most expensive signature she had ever written, the one she had pressed into the paper with the full weight of everything she had left. Owen took it back from her, folded it twice, and tucked it into his own coat pocket. "If Miss Dalton does not receive the return of the $940 she paid you this morning in full by sundown today, I will be filing charges in the morning," he said, "and I will be writing to the district court about the other women you have run this particular arrangement with, all of them." Briggs's pleasant expression had long since evaporated. "You cannot prove." "I can try," Owen said simply. "And you know as well as I do that I have been trying for 2 years. He held Briggs's gaze for one long, level moment. "Sundown." He turned and walked out, and Ella walked beside him, and it was not until they were back on the street in the afternoon sunshine that she realized she had been holding her breath for the better part of the last 10 minutes. "He will pay it back," Owen said, as if he had heard the question she had not yet asked. "He does not want the legal attention. He will find another town and another approach, and I will spend years trying to catch up to him again. But for today, you will get your money back." Ella stopped walking. Owen stopped 2 paces ahead of her and turned to look at her, and she studied his face in the full light of afternoon, the seriousness of it, the tiredness around the edges, the way he looked at her with something that was not pity but that was not entirely professional either. It was more complicated than either of those things. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why did you do that? You did not have to. I walked into your office. I am no one from nowhere." You could have told me the debt was clear and sent me on my way. Why did you go in there and do that?" Owen looked at her for a moment that stretched just slightly longer than was comfortable, and something moved in his expression, an adjustment, a decision. "Because you came here to sacrifice 2 years of your life for something that was never your responsibility," he said quietly. "And because Cutter Briggs has been preying on people in this county for too long, and every time I can draw a line I draw it." He paused. "And because it was the right thing to do." It was an honest answer. She could hear the simplicity of it, the absence of performance or posturing, and it went straight through her defenses and landed somewhere she had not expected anything to land in a very long time. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," he said. "Now come back to the office. I want to give you the documentation for the settled debt so that nobody can run this particular game on you again. And after that you should probably find a place to sleep that is not Cutter Briggs's saloon." She almost smiled. Almost. "I did notice that the boarding house appeared to have a sign in the window." "Mrs. Fenton's," he said. "She is suspicious of strangers, but she keeps a clean room, and her biscuits will make you reconsider every meal you have ever eaten." This time she did smile, just briefly, and she saw the way Owen Prescott looked at that smile like it was something he was not entirely prepared for. She filed that observation away and followed him back to the sheriff's office. The documentation was thorough. Owen had kept meticulous records, receipts, correspondence, signed statements from all three of the men Harlan Dalton had owed money to, confirming full satisfaction of the debts. He spread the papers on his desk and walked her through each one with the careful attention of someone who understood that she needed not just the information but the certainty. The proof that this thing was actually, genuinely, completely resolved. "Marcus Holloway," he said, pointing to a signature. "Your father borrowed $300 from him in 1879, paid back in full plus interest by October 1881. Mr. Holloway signed this himself." "Who paid it?" Ella asked. There was a brief pause. "Your father's foreman," Owen said. "Man named Tom Reedy. Apparently your father had left some cattle with him before he died, and Reedy sold them and brought the proceeds here. He felt it was the right thing to do." He did not look at her when he said it, and something in that careful avoidance of her gaze told her he was not telling her the complete story. She let it go, for now. There were limits to how much revelation a single afternoon could reasonably hold. She took the copies of the documentation he prepared for her and folded them carefully into the inside pocket of her coat, where they sat against her ribs like a different kind of armor than the kind she had arrived wearing. "Where were you headed?" Owen asked, "before you came to Kansas? Was there somewhere you were going after this, or were you planning to go back to Independence?" "I had not thought that far," she admitted. "I thought I would be indentured to a saloon. Future planning seemed somewhat irrelevant." Something tightened in his expression at the word indentured, a flash of something anger or maybe something closer to guilt, though she could not imagine why he would feel guilty. "What is in Independence?" he asked. "A boarding house, a sewing room, a window that looks out at a brick wall." She looked down at the papers on his desk. "Nothing that has ever felt like mine." She had not meant to say that. It had slipped out with the particular ease of a thought that had been held so long it had worn a groove, and now it rolled free before she could catch it. Owen was quiet for a moment. "Harlan's Creek is not a large town," he said carefully. "But the Women's Sewing Cooperative on the east side of the street has been looking for someone with skill since Mrs. Albright moved to Wichita in February. The pay is modest, but it is honest work, and Mrs. Fenton's rates are reasonable." He looked up from the desk. "I am not suggesting anything. I am simply providing information." "Of course," she said, and did not smile again, because she was almost entirely certain that if she smiled at Owen Prescott twice in one afternoon, something would shift in a way that she was not yet prepared to manage. The money arrived at the sheriff's office at 5:30 in the evening, brought by one of Briggs's men in a cloth bag, and handed over without comment or eye contact. Owen counted it out on the desk in front of Ella, every cent of $940, and handed it across to her with a formality that she understood was his way of restoring something to her. Not just the money but the dignity that had been stripped away when she sat down across from Cutter Briggs and believed every word he said. She took the tin box from inside her coat and packed the money back into it and fastened the latch, and when she looked up, Owen was watching her with that same complicated expression she had been unable to fully decipher all afternoon. "You can stay," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, softened around the edges in a way that she doubted he was entirely aware of. "In town, if you want to, or you can go back to Missouri. Either way, the debt is settled and you are free." Free. The words sat in the air between them with an unexpected weight. "I have not been free in a very long time," she said, and she heard the wonder in her own voice and could not entirely suppress it. "No," he said quietly. "I do not imagine you have." She stayed. She had not planned to, not consciously, but the following morning she woke in the clean, slightly suspicious hospitality of Mrs. Fenton's boarding house, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the brick wall in Independence, and thought about the sewing cooperative on the east side of the street, and thought about Owen Prescott's quiet, careful voice saying the debt is not yours to carry, and she went to speak with the cooperative. The cooperative was run by a woman named Grace Whitmore, who was perhaps 45, with iron-gray hair and hands that moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been stitching things together for 30 years. She looked at Ella's work, a quick sample on the spare machine in the corner, and hired her that same morning. "I do not know how long I will be staying," Ella said honestly. "I do not know how long any of us will be staying," Grace said, with the equanimity of a woman who had outlasted several failed harvests and one significant flood. "You stitch well and you show up. That is all I require." Ella showed up. She showed up to the cooperative at 7 in the morning and worked until 5 in the afternoon, and then walked the 2 blocks back to Mrs. Fenton's through the evening air of a Kansas spring. And on the third day of this routine, she looked up from the main street to find Owen Prescott walking in the same direction. "Miss Dalton," he said, with the slight formality he seemed to apply to their encounters in public. "Sheriff Prescott," she said. They walked 2 blocks in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was very charged, and at the corner where their paths diverged he stopped and said, "There is a community dinner at the church on Friday. Mrs. Fenton usually attends. You would be welcome." "I will think about it," she said. She went. The community dinner was held in the open field beside the Methodist Church, which in 1882 was a modest whitewashed building at the north end of Harlan's Creek that doubled as the schoolroom on weekdays. Long tables had been set up in the evening air, and the whole town appeared to have arrived: families, farmers, merchants, the schoolteacher, the doctor, the women from the cooperative, and Sheriff Owen Prescott, who was standing near the end of the table closest to the church wall when Ella arrived with Mrs. Fenton. He saw her before she saw him. She knew this because, when she finally located him in the crowd, his eyes were already on her, and he looked away quickly enough that the looking away was more revealing than the looking. She sat down at the table and was immediately absorbed into the particular social current of a small frontier town. Introduced to names, she immediately began to categorize and forget and relearn: the doctor's wife, the schoolteacher's husband, the teenage daughters of the feed store owner, an older farmer named Gus who apparently had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. Owen made his way down the table eventually, pulled out the chair across from her with a small nod of greeting that somehow managed to be both casual and deliberate. "You came," he said. "I said I would think about it," she said. "I thought about it, and the conclusion of your thinking was favorable. The conclusion of my thinking was that Mrs. Fenton said the food would be worth it, and Mrs. Fenton has not yet given me bad information." The corner of his mouth moved. "She has strong opinions about the quality of the cornbread. She does not lack for opinions in general." He smiled then, properly, and it transformed his face in a way that was entirely unexpected and quite devastating in a manner Ella was not at all prepared for. Owen Prescott did not smile often. She had gathered this in the few days she had known him, and the effect of it when it did happen was therefore significantly more powerful than it might otherwise have been. She looked down at her plate and told herself to be sensible. The evening passed with the warmth of good food and ordinary conversation, and at some point, the conversation between the two of them deepened from pleasantries into something more genuine, the way conversations sometimes did in the particular loosening that came with an outdoor evening in spring, and the presence of 100 people going about their own business around you. They talked about the town, its history, the complicated legacy of its name, which Owen acknowledged with a directness that she appreciated, not looking away from the fact that the town bore her father's name and that this was strange for her. They talked about Kansas, which Owen had come to from Ohio 8 years ago, following an uncle who had since moved on but leaving Owen with the sheriff's badge in the county and apparently the conviction that he was going to stay. "Ohio," she said, "that is a long way from a cattle town." "Most sheriffs in Kansas are from somewhere other than Kansas," he said. "The territory attracts people in motion. Sometimes they stop moving. And you stopped here." "I stopped here," he confirmed, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested this was a more complicated fact than it appeared, that there had been a reason for the stopping, a story inside the stopping, that he was not yet ready to offer up. She did not push. She understood the value of a story held close. She rode back to Mrs. Fenton's in the woman's small buggy at the end of the evening, and as they left the field she looked back and saw Owen standing at the edge of the gathering, watching the buggy go, and she turned back around before he could catch her looking. The weeks settled into a rhythm that felt, dangerously, like belonging. She worked at the cooperative and grew familiar with Grace Whitmore's exacting standards, and her dry humor, and her extensive opinions about the deficiencies of men who could not sew a button properly. She grew familiar with the other women who worked there, Clara Holt, who was 22 and newly married and perpetually flushed with happiness that Ella found both enviable and slightly exhausting, and Ruth Sampson, who was 50 and had buried a husband and 2 children, and who stitched everything with a precise ferocity that spoke of the specific grief that becomes competence. She grew familiar with Mrs. Fenton, whose suspicion of strangers was, Ella discovered, a form of affection in disguise. The woman expressed care through the quality of the meals she provided and the detail of the advice she dispensed, and by the end of the 3rd week she was dispensing quite a lot of it. "Sheriff Prescott is a good man," Mrs. Fenton said one morning, setting eggs on the table with the particular emphasis of someone making a point. "I am sure he is," Ella said, reaching for the coffee. "He has been the sheriff here for 6 years. Before that he was a deputy. He came from Ohio, you know. His uncle was the original sheriff." "He mentioned Ohio," Ella said carefully. "He has not found a woman who could hold his attention for more than a season," Mrs. Fenton said, with the air of someone who considers this information relevant. "He is particular, which I find admirable. A man who is particular is a man who knows the value of things." Ella looked at Mrs. Fenton over the rim of her coffee cup, and Mrs. Fenton looked back with the perfect innocence of someone who has no agenda whatsoever. "Thank you for breakfast," Ella said. She grew, also, more familiar with Owen Prescott himself, in the gradual way of 2 people in a small town who occupy adjacent spaces, and therefore encounter each other with increasing frequency. He stopped by the cooperative some mornings on his rounds, exchanging a few words with Grace and inevitably with Ella. He began to wait for her sometimes at the end of the main street at the end of the day, not explicitly, not in a way that required acknowledgement, but he was there, and she began to walk home that way on purpose. They talked about small things, often the weather, the progress of the spring planting out on the farms, the territorial politics that Grace and Mrs. Fenton and seemingly every person in Harlan's Creek had strong opinions about. but also about larger things. Slowly, the way large things were uncovered in a prairie landscape, gradually revealing themselves as the light changed. He told her about Ohio, about a younger brother named Daniel who had died of typhoid when Owen was 17, and Owen had been, in some way he had never fully articulated, responsible for, not in the sense of having caused the illness, but in the sense that he had been the older brother, and had felt the particular crushing weight of that role, and its failure in a way that had shaped the next 15 years of his life. "I became a sheriff because I could not save my brother," he said one evening as they walked the edge of the town where the main street gave way to the open prairie. "Not in the immediate sense, not as a direct line, but underneath it. I wanted to be the person who could prevent the wrong things from happening, who could stand between people and the things that hurt them." "And how often does it work?" she asked. "Not as often as I would like," he said, "but sometimes, often enough to keep trying." She looked at his profile against the last of the western light and thought about a man who had walked into a saloon and retrieved a fraudulent contract and said the debt is not yours to carry. And she understood now where that impulse had come from, not from professional obligation, not entirely, but from something older and deeper, a refusal to watch someone carry a burden that had been placed on them by the carelessness of someone else. "You could not have saved your brother," she said. "Typhoid does not yield to will." "No," he said, "but the understanding of that and the feeling of it are two different things." "Yes," she said softly, "they are." She thought of her father, of all the years she had spent feeling responsible for the wreckage he had left, the way the feeling had lived in her chest like something lodged, like a splinter too deep to extract. She told him this. She did not plan to tell him, but they had walked to the place where the prairie opened out, and the sky was enormous and close in the peculiar way of Kansas evenings, and the conversation had arrived there naturally, the way conversations did when trust had been quietly, carefully built over days and weeks. "He left when I was 17, she said. "I had a job as a seamstress's assistant. I was already mostly keeping us both anyway." He was not a bad man, precisely. He was weak in the way that some people are weak, the kind of weakness that looks like charm and optimism and then turns out to be a refusal to be responsible. She paused. "I spent 5 years being angry at him, and then he was dead, and then I spent another year being angry at him for dying before I could stop being angry at him." "That is a particular kind of grief," Owen said. "Yes, it is." She looked at the horizon, at the darkness beginning to pool at the edges of the sky, and then the debt, and then the contract, and then you. She had not meant to end the list there with him in that position. The sentence had arrived that way, and she stood with it in the air between them and did not try to revise it. He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad you came in through that door," he said, and his voice was different from his usual controlled, even tone. It had something in it that was unguarded and genuine, and that went straight through her. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her. "So am I," she said. They stood at the edge of the prairie in the failing light, and neither of them moved, and the silence was the kind that contains more than words can hold. And then Owen Prescott did something that surprised her. He reached out and took her hand carefully, formally, as though the gesture required its own kind of deliberateness, and held it for just a moment before letting go. "I should walk you back before it gets dark," he said, with the practical gracefulness of a man who understood the value of not pressing too fast. "You should," she agreed. They walked back to town with 4 inches of air between them and the entire open sky overhead, and when they reached Mrs. Fenton's door, Ella turned to say good night and found him looking at her with an expression that contained everything they had not yet said, all of it visible and honest and quietly, steadily present. "Good night, Ella," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the particular weight of it in his voice made something shift in her chest that was going to take her a very long time to settle. "Good night, Owen," she said. She went inside. She stood in her room with the door closed and her back against it, and her heart doing something entirely unreasonable. And she thought that she had come to this town to settle a debt, and she had found something she had no name for yet. But she was beginning to suspect the name, and it frightened her quite thoroughly. The next morning she went to work and stitched 14 yards of calico and was entirely, pointedly normal, and Grace Whitmore looked at her twice and said nothing, which told Ella that Grace had noticed everything and was simply being merciful. 3 days later, something happened that changed the nature of the situation. Ella was walking to the cooperative at 7 in the morning when she saw a wagon pull up at the end of the main street, and in the wagon, next to a driver she did not recognize, was Cutter Briggs. He was not looking at her. He was speaking to the driver, pointing up the street, and his expression was the one she remembered from across the table in the Prairie Rose, pleasant and cold and purposeful. She went directly to Owen's office. He was already at his desk, and he looked up when she came in with her jaw set and her hands steady despite the fact that something cold had run down her spine the moment she saw Briggs's face. "Briggs is back," she said. Owen was already standing. "Where?" "At the east end of the main street. He had a driver with him. He looked like a man arriving with a plan." Owen's expression was very still in a way that was not calmness, but rather the particular concentrated stillness of a person running through options and arriving at decisions very quickly. "I need you to stay here," he said. "We had this conversation," she said. "This is different," he said. "Briggs did not come back to Harlan's Creek because he wants to see the spring weather. He came back because he believes he has something to use." He looked at her directly. "You. He came back because you are still here and he thinks your being here is leverage of some kind, something he can use to complicate my ability to move against him." The realization settled over her cold and clear. "He is going to claim I owe him something," she said. "He is going to say the contract was valid and I am in breach. He is going to make it a legal matter." "He is going to try," Owen said. "He has done this before. He comes back with a different story, new documents, a claim of damages. He knows the frontier court system is slow and expensive, and he counts on people not having the resources to fight it." He paused. "I have been preparing for this. I have documentation. I have correspondence with the district court. He will not succeed. But it will take time," she said, "and it will be unpleasant, and it is happening because of me." "It is happening because of him," Owen said, with a sharpness that was clearly not aimed at her. "Not because of you, never because of you." She looked at him, and saw in the sharp, bright clarity of his anger something she had been carefully not looking at for weeks. The way he watched her, the particular quality of his attention, the way he had said her name on that prairie evening in a voice that she had replayed more times than she was comfortable admitting. "Owen," she said. He was already reaching for his hat. He stopped. "This is going to be difficult," she said. "What Briggs is going to try to do, and I am the reason it is happening. I know you will say I am not the reason, and I know that in the legal and moral sense you are correct, but I am the practical reason, and you know that too." "Yes," he said, "I know. I did not come here to make trouble for anyone. I know that too." She took a breath. "What do you need me to do?" Something in him adjusted, not surprised exactly, but moved by the directness of the question and the absence of apology in it, the shift from self-reproach to practical cooperation. He looked at her for a moment with that complicated expression. "I need you to sign a statement for the district court," he said, "describing the circumstances of the original contract in detail with dates and figures. It needs to be thorough and specific. I have been corresponding with the district attorney in Wichita for 6 months about Briggs, and your account could be the thing that finally makes the case strong enough to act on." "Then I will write it," she said. "It may require you to testify," he said, "if it comes to a proceeding." "Then I will testify," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "You came here to clear a debt and leave," he said. "Instead you are still here and Cutter Briggs is coming back, and I am asking you to put your name on a legal document that could make you a target of a man who is not known for responding to obstacles gracefully." "Yes," she said. "You do not have to," he said. "I want you to understand that. You could go back to Missouri and this would resolve without you." "Would it?" she asked. Or would he find another woman the way he found me, and the woman after that, and the woman after that? Owen was quiet. "Write me the statement," Ella said. "Tell me what you need." He held her gaze for a moment that felt very long. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly. "No one ever is," she said. "That is rather the point." They sat down together at his desk, and he guided her through the statement, asking careful, specific questions, and she answered them with the precision of a woman who had spent years managing the details of other people's failures and had learned to be extremely accurate about the facts of things. She described the letter from the county records office. She described the journey from Independence. She described sitting across from Briggs and the documents he had shown her and the specific claims he had made. She described the contract and the terms and the moment she had signed it. Owen wrote it out in full, his handwriting clear and unhurried, and then read it back to her for accuracy, and she corrected 2 small details and confirmed the rest. She signed it. He folded it carefully and sealed it and addressed it to the district attorney in Wichita. "I will send this today," he said, "and I will go speak with Briggs now. He will find this is a different visit than his first." "I would like to come," she said. "Not this time," he said, and his voice was gentle in a way that took the edge off what was essentially an order. "I need him to understand that you are not accessible to him. That there is nothing he can threaten or offer or claim that gives him any access to you. The best way to establish that is to handle this without you in the room." She understood the logic. She did not like it, but she understood it. "Come back and tell me what happens," she said. "I will," he said. He came back 2 hours later, and his expression was the controlled one. The one she had learned meant he was working to keep something from showing, but the thing it was keeping from showing appeared to be satisfaction rather than anything darker. "Briggs presented a document claiming you owed him a sum in compensation for breach of contract," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the deliberateness of a man who has been on his feet all morning. "I presented documentation of the settled debt, the district attorney's correspondence, and your sworn statement. I also presented documentation of 3 other cases in this county with very similar patterns, which I have been collecting for 2 years. And," Ella said. "He left," Owen said. "I advised him that his departure from Caldwell County would be the most effective way to avoid being the subject of a district court investigation, and he appeared to find that advice compelling." Ella exhaled. "He is gone," she said. "He is on a road heading west," Owen said. "I have sent word to the Wichita office and to 2 other county sheriffs with the documentation. He will not be able to operate the way he has been, not in this region. He may move further west. He may find that harder than he expects." He paused. "It is not a perfect resolution. Men like Briggs are difficult to permanently stop, but he is finished in Caldwell County." She sat with that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Again. You did the important part," he said. "Your statement you could have refused." "I was not going to refuse," she said simply. He looked at her across the desk, and the afternoon light was coming through the window and falling across the paper between them, and the office was quiet in the way of a room where something important had just been resolved. "Ella," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was carefully. "I would like to take you to dinner. Not at the community dinner, and not a meal from Mrs. Fenton's table. I would like to take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant on a specific evening, and sit across from you without legal documents between us, and have a conversation that is not about debt or fraud or court proceedings." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the particular vulnerability of a man who does not often do this sort of thing, who has just said a true thing in full view of another person, and is now waiting to see what they do with it. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he agreed, and the relief in his voice was so faint that she would have missed it entirely if she had not been paying very close attention. She had been paying very close attention. She wore her best dress to dinner, a soft blue wool that she had made herself in the first few weeks at the cooperative when there was a quiet afternoon and a length of fabric going spare, and which she had sewn with a care she had not consciously intended, but which, looking at the result, was entirely legible. She spent longer than usual on her hair. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room at Mrs. Fenton's, and thought that she looked like a woman going to dinner, and not at all like a woman who had arrived in this town 4 weeks ago with a locked tin box, and a debt that was not hers, and a heart that had been closed up tight for 5 years of surviving. Owen was waiting outside the hotel. He had changed his coat for a dark one she had not seen before, and he was standing with his hands in his pockets in the way he sometimes stood when he was trying to appear more at ease than he felt. And when he saw her coming down the street, something happened in his face that he did not manage to keep from showing. "You look beautiful," he said, and then looked slightly startled by his own directness. "You look considerably better without the star pinned to your coat," she said, because it was true and because she wanted him to know she had noticed him as a person and not only as a function. He almost smiled. Then he did smile. Then he offered his arm and she took it, and they went into the hotel restaurant, which was the finest establishment in Harlan's Creek, and had recently acquired a tablecloth and a candle, and a menu written on a chalkboard, which Owen studied with the serious attention he brought to most things. The dinner was 2 hours long and went by in 30 minutes, which was the particular magic of a conversation where nothing was being carefully managed or withheld for the first time. They talked about books. He read widely for a frontier sheriff, kept a collection of novels and histories in his office that she had noticed and had been curious about, and she had strong opinions about what she had read during the quiet years in the sewing room in Missouri. And discovering that their opinions overlapped in some places and diverged dramatically in others was unexpectedly delightful. They talked about what they wanted, the large vague shape of a future that neither of them had let themselves look at directly for some time. "I want to stay in one place," she said, and heard the simplicity of it, the sheer relief of wanting something simple. "I have moved 5 times since I was 17. I want to know a street well enough that I know which boards creak in winter. I want to know the neighbors well enough to know what they are growing in their gardens. I want to be somewhere long enough that it becomes mine. This town has the disadvantage of bearing your father's name," he said, and it was not a gentle way to say it, but it was an honest one. "Yes," she said. "I know." She considered the candlelight for a moment. "But the town is not its name. The town is Grace and Ruth and Clara and Mrs. Fenton and the field behind the church. The name is just a word." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to stop being alone," he said, and the simplicity of it matched hers, the same kind of wanting something so basic it had been looked away from. "I am good at the work. I believe in the work. But I have been doing it for 6 years and going home to a silent house every evening, and that has been—" He paused. "Enough. I have had enough of it." She looked at him across the candle, and what she felt was not the complicated, braced, provisional feeling of someone considering a risk. It was something more open than that. Something that had been carefully locked for 5 years and was now, with a small, embarrassing simplicity, choosing to unlock. "Then we are after the same thing," she said. "It appears so," he said. He walked her home that night under a full Kansas moon that was doing its level best to be absurdly romantic, and at Mrs. Fenton's door he stopped and looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached up and very carefully, very deliberately, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and his fingers barely brushed her cheek, and she felt that touch from her hairline to the soles of her feet. "Good night, Ella," he said. "Good night, Owen," she said, and she went inside and stood in the dark of the entrance hall with her eyes closed, and her heart doing the same unreasonable thing it had been doing since the prairie evening, only more so, only much more so. The courtship that followed was the careful, deliberate, thoroughly decent thing that it would have to be in a small frontier town in 1882, where everyone knew everyone's business and Mrs. Fenton had opinions. It was walks along the prairie edge in the evenings and community dinners on Fridays and long conversations in the cooperative when Owen stopped by, and Grace Whitmore found tasks to do in the back room. It was small things. A book left on her workbench with a particular passage marked because he thought she would find it interesting. A bunch of wildflowers set on the windowsill of the cooperative one morning with no note, because in a town where everyone knew everything, a note was entirely unnecessary. A cup of coffee brought to the sheriff's office on a cold morning when she had a document to review, and the way he looked up when she came in with it, as though she were the best thing the morning had produced. It was also, increasingly, a thing that the whole town regarded with what she could only describe as collective satisfaction, as though Owen Prescott finding someone had been on the community's agenda for some time, and Ella Dalton arriving through the door of his office in boots and dust and fury had been the resolution they had all been waiting for. "It is entirely unnecessary for everyone to have opinions about my life," she said to Grace one afternoon. "Of course it is," Grace said, without looking up from her stitching, "and yet here we are." The summer arrived and deepened, and Ella put down what she had described to Owen as roots. She signed a 3-month agreement at the cooperative, then a 6-month one. She settled her arrangement with Mrs. Fenton on slightly more permanent terms. She learned the streets well enough that she knew the boards that creaked in the morning frost. She learned the gardens. She also, with a caution that was now beginning to feel less like protection and more like a habit she might be ready to release, allowed herself to love Owen Prescott. She did not announce this, not even to herself, not in so many words. She arrived at it the way she arrived at most things, through the accumulation of evidence, through the weight of many small moments adding up to a thing that could not be denied. The moment she finally admitted it clearly was a Tuesday evening in July, when a summer storm rolled in off the prairie with the particular fast ferocity of Kansas weather, and she was caught on the street 2 blocks from Mrs. Fenton's in a downpour that appeared within approximately 30 seconds of a clear sky. And Owen appeared from nowhere, running in the same direction, wearing absolutely no coat, and carrying hers over his arm, because he had seen the clouds from the office window and come out looking for her. She stood in the rain and looked at him, holding out her coat with the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, and an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and desperately fond. And she thought, there it is. That is the thing. That is what this has been for 6 months, that expression, that exactness of care. She put the coat on and they ran for Mrs. Fenton's porch, and they stood there dripping and laughing, genuinely, the kind of laughter that comes from a body that has remembered something it forgot it could do, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and it was entirely obvious that they had both arrived at the same conclusion. He kissed her on Mrs. Fenton's porch in the July rain, carefully and then less carefully, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding for 6 months, which turned out to be quite a lot. He proposed to her 6 weeks later, on the edge of the prairie at sunset, which was both the most cliched and the most absolutely correct possible setting, and he did it without elaborate ceremony, simply took both her hands and looked at her and said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life building something with you." "If you will," she said, "yes." She said it so quickly that he laughed, and she laughed too, and he pulled her into his arms in the September evening, and held her with the particular fierceness of a man who had been waiting longer than he had admitted. The wedding was in October, in the field behind the Methodist church, under a sky that Grace Whitmore described later as performing, as though it had been specifically instructed to be magnificent, which it had. The whole town attended, which was not surprising. Mrs. Fenton cried, which surprised exactly no one who knew her. Grace Whitmore did not cry but stood with her arms folded, and an expression of immense satisfaction that was more eloquent than tears. Ella wore a dress she had made herself over the preceding 2 months. At night, after her work at the cooperative, a thing of cream wool with careful needlework at the collar and cuffs that she had spent more hours on than was perhaps entirely rational, but that was hers in the absolute, complete sense, made by her hands. And Owen, when he saw her at the edge of the field, stopped and stood very still for a moment with his gray eyes doing something that she would remember for the rest of her life. "You are extraordinary," he said when she reached him. "You are going to make me cry before the ceremony even starts," she said. "I am absolutely not," he said, and took her hands, and they turned to face the minister with their fingers intertwined and the October sky above them, and the whole assembled fact of the community they had both, separately and together, chosen. The ceremony was simple. The vows were traditional, and they said them with the direct, unembellished sincerity of two people who had spent enough of their lives in complicated emotional territory to appreciate the value of simple truths. She was his and he was hers, and they both knew the full weight of those words and were choosing them with open eyes. The celebration afterward was the most alive she had felt in years. Owen had arranged a house, a place on the far end of the East Street, not large but solid, 2 rooms with a back garden that he had already begun to plant in a modest way, and which she spent the first 3 weeks of their marriage expanding into something that she declared was going to be the best kitchen garden in Caldwell County by the following spring. "That is an ambitious claim," he said, watching her from the back doorway with his coffee. "I am an ambitious woman," she said, not looking up from the soil. "Yes," he said, with the particular warmth of a man whose wife's ambition he finds enormously attractive. "You are." The winter was cold and close in theirs. They learned each other in the way that people learn each other in the private warmth of a shared space, the small habits and preferences and particular comforts that do not show themselves until proximity makes them visible. She learned that he woke early and was quiet in the first hour of the morning in a way that was not distant but private, processing, and that after that first hour he became warmer and more talkative. He learned that she needed time to think through large decisions and would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a conversation, not because she had nothing to say, but because she was still arriving at what she actually thought. They learned when to press and when to leave space. They learned that 2 strong-willed people in a small house required the particular practice of being gentle about the things that mattered most, and they were not always perfectly graceful about this. And there were evenings when the kitchen was tense in a way that required one of them to step out to the porch and look at the winter stars and breathe before coming back in to say the thing that needed saying more carefully. But they always came back in. That was what she noticed most about Owen in those first months. He always came back in. He did not use silence as punishment. He did not walk away from a difficult thing and leave it lying in the middle of the floor. He came back, and he said what he needed to say, and he listened to what she needed to say, and they worked through it with the same deliberate care he brought to everything. She had not known, before him, how rare that was. By spring she had thrown herself into the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that Grace called impressive and Mrs. Fenton called excessive and Owen called extraordinary, and quietly recruited himself to assist with, which was how she learned that he had absolutely no skill with growing things but would stand in a garden for an hour making honest efforts at her direction, and looking endearingly defeated by a potato. "The potato is winning," she said. "The potato is better at this than I am," he agreed. "I accept this." "I appreciate your honesty," she said, and handed him a different tool and pointed him at a task more suited to his abilities, which turned out to be digging and carrying and less finicky work. And he did this with the cheerful competence of a man who has found his appropriate role and is comfortable in it. The letter from the district attorney in Wichita arrived in April, 9 months after Ella had signed her statement. It informed Owen that Cutter Briggs had been taken into custody in Colorado Territory on charges related to fraud and the coercion of labor contracts, that Ella's statement had been among the evidence presented to the grand jury, and that the case was expected to proceed to trial in the autumn. Owen read it at breakfast and handed it across the table to her. She read it twice. She thought about the $940 she had carried in a locked tin box across 300 miles. She thought about her mother's brooch. She thought about the women who had sat in the prairie rows before her and signed contracts and believed what Briggs told them and had no one walk into the right office at the right time. She looked up from the letter. "It is not enough," she said, "for all of them, one trial." "No," Owen said, "it is not, but it is a beginning." She nodded slowly. "I want to write to the district attorney," she said. "I want to ask about the other women. Whether any of them can be found, whether any of them can get what they are owed back." "I will help you," he said without hesitation. "I know," she said. And she did know, which was still, after almost a year, something she found she had not entirely adjusted to the knowledge that there was someone beside her who did not require convincing to do the right thing, who moved toward it naturally and without having to be argued into it. She wrote the letter. The district attorney responded. The inquiry took months and was not entirely successful, and 3 of the 7 other known cases were too old or too poorly documented to pursue. But 4 women received partial restitution, and 2 of those were enough money to matter in a significant way, and Ella felt something settle in her chest at each resolution like pieces of a thing coming to rest. That summer she discovered she was expecting a child. She told Owen in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and he went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded something large. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I have been certain for 3 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be very certain before I was not certain in front of you." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her hands, and his face was doing things she had not seen it do before: joy, transparent and unguarded, the kind of joy that only came from the total absence of armor, and she thought, "There is the version of him that no one else sees, the completely undefended version, and it is being shown to me." "A baby," he said, with the slightly stunned wonder of someone to whom the fact of this has just become real. "A baby," she confirmed. He pulled her into his arms and she went, and she could feel his heart through his shirt, the rapid, faithful beat of it, and she pressed her cheek against his shoulder and felt something in her own chest that was not completeness exactly, because she had been complete before, but was more like the addition of an entirely new dimension to something she had already thought was fully formed. Their son was born in February of 1884, in the bedroom of the house on the east street of Harlan's Creek, with the doctor and Mrs. Fenton both in attendance, the latter having appointed herself to this role without anyone asking, and the doctor having long since learned that Mrs. Fenton's opinions about her role in community events were not negotiable. Owen was in the parlor. He had been there for 8 hours. Mrs. Fenton sent him out to the porch at one point, and he went and stood in the February cold, and when she opened the door and said, "Come in and meet your son," he crossed the room so fast that he nearly knocked over the lamp. The baby was small and pink and enormously loud, which Mrs. Fenton called a very good sign. He had Owen's dark hair, which was visible from the first day. He had Ella's eyes, which became apparent within the first few weeks, the same gray-green, the same quality of attention. They named him James Daniel Prescott, the Daniel for Owen's brother, which Ella had suggested quietly, and which had made Owen look at her for a long moment with an expression she did not try to name because it was too large for naming. James was an excellent baby in the sense that he was vigorous and healthy and entirely convinced of his own centrality to the universe, which was appropriate and also occasionally exhausting. And he became the beloved object of the entire town with a speed that was slightly overwhelming for his parents and entirely unsurprising to Grace Whitmore, who said privately that any child belonging to those 2 was going to be remarkable, and she had planned for that outcome. Owen was a father in the way he was everything deliberately, attentively, with the full weight of his attention brought to bear on the small daily details of another person's existence. He took James for walks in the morning in the first weeks, giving Ella the sleep she desperately needed. He learned with remarkable speed how to manage all the practical requirements of a small child, not just the pleasant parts but all of it, the whole necessary unglamorous work of it, and he did it all without treating any of it as beneath him or as something that naturally belonged to her. She watched him with James and thought again about what he had told her that first autumn, that he had become a sheriff because he could not save his brother, because he needed to be the person who could stand between people and the things that hurt them. And she thought about what he had grown into since then, beyond the wound that had shaped him. This careful, present man who brought the same protective instinct to a small pink baby that he had brought to a woman standing in a doorway with dust on her boots and murder in her eyes, who had never in his life treated another person's burdens as inconsequential or their pain as something to step around. The debt was not yours to carry. She thought about that sentence often, still, though differently now than she had in those first stunned moments in his office. She had come to understand it as more than a legal fact, more than the practical correction of Cutter Briggs's fraud. She had come to understand it as the thing Owen had said about himself, the belief underneath everything he did, that people should not have to carry what has been unfairly placed on them, that one of the things worth doing in a life was standing in the gap between a person and the weight they had not deserved. It was the thing she had fallen in love with, she thought, before she had known she was falling in love. That first, that quality, that particular steady insistence on justice as a form of care. She told him this one evening when James was 3 months old and sleeping in the small room across the hall, and the house was quiet in the particular way of post-baby quiet, which was both a relief and a miracle every single time. Owen listened with his head slightly bowed, the way he listened to important things, and when she finished he looked up at her with gray eyes that were entirely unguarded. "I think," he said carefully, "that you were always going to be fine, with or without me. You walked into that office, and you stood in that doorway, and you were fierce and afraid, and you were not going to let either of those things stop you from doing what you had come to do." "I had come to do the wrong thing," she pointed out. "I had come to sacrifice myself for a fraudulent debt." "You had come to do what you believed was right," he said. "That is not a small thing. The debt was wrong, but the impulse behind it was not. You are the kind of person who does not look away from an obligation. I did not need to save you. I needed to correct the information." She considered this. "You did more than correct the information," she said. "Yes," he admitted. "I did. Because by the time I understood everything, I was not able to do less." She leaned across and kissed him, and he put his arm around her and she settled against him in the lamplight, and the house was quiet around them, and James was sleeping, and the kitchen garden was sleeping under 2 inches of late winter snow, and Harlan's Creek was going about its ordinary business on the other side of the walls. She thought about the town and its complicated name, and she thought that she had made her peace with it. The name was her father's legacy, the mark he had made on a place he had passed through and left behind, but it was not her definition of that place. Harlan's Creek was hers now too, on different terms, on terms she had earned through her own presence and her own work and her own choices. She had added her own layer to it. She intended to keep adding. 2 years passed in the full and particular way of years that are genuinely, essentially happy, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary friction of a life in a frontier town in the 1880s, not without the challenges of work and weather, and the endless complex business of a marriage between 2 strong-willed people learning each other more deeply with each season. But fully, genuinely, completely happy in the way that she had not thought to expect and had been too busy surviving to hope for in all the years before Owen and the town and the garden, and the small boy with dark hair and gray-green eyes who was, by the age of 2, already as particular and attentive and quietly formidable as both his parents. James learned to walk in the kitchen, hanging onto chairs and Owen's trouser legs and the edge of the workbench. He learned to talk with an enthusiasm that Mrs. Fenton declared excessive and Grace said was entirely predictable, and Ella found so delightful that she wrote down half the things he said in a small notebook she kept for the purpose. The cooperative grew. Grace retired gracefully from the running of it in the spring of 1886 and handed the management to Ella with a formality that was Grace's version of a very large gesture, and Ella took it with the seriousness it deserved and ran it with the combination of precision and warmth that she had learned in part from Grace herself, and in part from 6 years of being with a man who managed to be both absolutely firm and genuinely kind, simultaneously, without effort. The cooperative employed 8 women by 1887, and was producing work sold as far as Wichita, and Ella was writing letters to the district office about expanding the trading territory, and Owen was reading her drafts at the kitchen table in the evenings and making the occasional quiet suggestion that she sometimes took and sometimes didn't. "You have strong opinions about correspondence," she said one evening. "I have strong opinions about many things," he said. "You have noticed this over the past 5 years." "I have," she said. "I married you anyway." "The bravest decision you have made," he said with perfect solemnity. "Second bravest," she said. "Walking into your office was the bravest." He looked at her with that smile. The one that she had decided in the first year was specifically designed to make her entirely useless, and that had not diminished in its effect over 5 years, which was something she suspected was going to remain constant indefinitely. She discovered she was expecting a second child in the autumn of 1887, and she told Owen at breakfast again, on a Tuesday again, and he went still again, and the joy on his face was the same complete, unguarded thing it had been the first time. "James is going to be very opinionated about this," she said. "James is very opinionated about everything," Owen said. "It is both his best and his most exhausting quality." "He gets it from you," she said. "He gets it from both of us," he said. "This is a case where the attribution is shared equally." Their daughter arrived in April of 1888, in the same bedroom and with the same assembled attendants, the doctor and Mrs. Fenton, and by this time James, who was 4 and who had been told he would be brought in to meet the baby after the work was done, and who stood in the doorway of the bedroom in his small, serious way, and looked at his sister with an expression so exactly like his father's that both Ella and Mrs. Fenton, for entirely different reasons, had to look elsewhere for a moment. They named her Margaret for Ella's mother, and the naming felt like a kind of completion. A circle closed, her mother's silver brooch gone into the darkness of an impossible past, and her mother's name returned into the light of a future, breathing and new. Owen stood in the bedroom holding Margaret with the same look on his face as he had held James for the first time, though different too, the wonder deepened by experience, by knowing now what this small beginning was going to grow into, and he looked up at Ella and said, very quietly, "You have given me everything." "We gave each other everything," she said. "That is rather how it works." "Yes," he said and smiled, and she saw in that smile all of it, the gray office and the dusty boots and the contract on the bar, and 6 years of walking the same edge of prairie in the changing light. And she thought that a life was made of so many things that could not have been predicted, and so many things that could not have been planned, and that the only thing she had ever been able to control was the quality of her own choices and the willingness to remain open to what she had not expected to find. She had come to settle a debt and found a sheriff who said the debt was not hers to carry. She had found, in the exact same moment, everything else. The summer Margaret turned one was a particularly good summer in Caldwell County, long warm evenings, and enough rain, a rare, generous combination in Kansas. Owen's jurisdiction had expanded by then, and he had a deputy, a young man named Billy Crane who was eager and earnest and reminded Owen occasionally of a slightly less confident version of himself at 25. And he had begun to talk about eventually transitioning into a more administrative role if the county seat agreed, which would mean less time on the road and more time at home, which was what he wanted. Ella had begun to expand the cooperative's work in a new direction, partnering with 2 women in Wichita to establish a wholesale arrangement, and was spending 1 afternoon a week on the bookkeeping for this, with a ferocity that Ruth Sampson called impressive and Owen called quietly terrifying in the most admiring possible way. James, who was 5, had decided that he was going to be a sheriff when he grew up, which Owen privately found overwhelming in a way he could not entirely articulate, and which Ella found absolutely clarifying. The next generation of the particular stubbornness, right there, already fully formed. Margaret was 14 months old and had recently discovered walking, and had also discovered that walking could be used as a delivery mechanism for bringing things from one room and placing them in entirely different rooms for reasons that were never fully explained. And the house had a kind of delightful ongoing chaos to it that was entirely different from the silence Owen had described on their first dinner, and that he appeared to find, without question, infinitely better. On a September evening in 1889, Owen and Ella walked the prairie edge as they had walked it hundreds of times over the 7 years since the afternoon he had first suggested it, with the particular indirection of a man who had not yet said what he meant but was working up to it. James was at Mrs. Fenton's for the evening, the older woman's delight in him being both genuine and very useful. Margaret was asleep in the house, watched over by Clara Holt, who was now Clara Farrington and had 2 children of her own but who still worked part-time at the cooperative, and who watched the Prescott children occasionally in the comfortable reciprocity of a community where people helped each other. The evening was the particular golden color of a Kansas September, the light slanting low and warm across the grass, the sky vast and patient and deeply blue. "Do you ever miss Independence?" Owen asked. He asked sometimes, not with any anxiety behind it, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to know her. "No," she said. "I miss the idea of it, I suppose, the idea of having a place, but the actual place, the brick wall and the narrow room, no, I have never missed that." "Good," he said. "Do you ever miss Ohio?" she asked. "I miss my brother," he said, as he sometimes said, with the directness he had learned to apply to grief. "But Ohio is just the place where I lost him. This is the place where I have everything I have built since." She took his arm, and they walked in the September light, and the town was behind them and the prairie was ahead, and the sky was enormous and close, and she thought about the word home, which she had not been able to use without qualification for most of her adult life, and found that she could use it now without qualification or hesitation or the small flinch of someone who has learned not to trust it. This was home. The house and the garden and the cooperative and the field behind the church and this exact edge of grass and sky. These people, Owen, James, Margaret, Grace and Ruth and Clara and Mrs. Fenton and Billy Crane and the doctor and the schoolteacher and all the rest, the whole accumulated, ordinary, miraculous community of a small Kansas town at the end of a decade that had asked a great deal of everyone in it and had given back generously to those who stayed. She had stayed. She had come to settle a debt and she had stayed. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you were in your office that afternoon." He looked at her and the September light was on his face, and he was looking at her with the open, unhurried warmth of a man who has arrived, fully and without reservation, at exactly where he wanted to be. "So am I," he said, "every single day." She leaned her head against his shoulder as they walked, and the sky went from gold to rose to the first deep blue of evening, and somewhere behind them in the town James was telling Mrs. Fenton, with the elaborate seriousness of a 5-year-old who has considered the matter at length, about the precise nature of his future intentions, and Mrs. Fenton was listening with the full and genuine attention she gave to all things that mattered, and Margaret was dreaming whatever small, brilliant dreams a 14-month-old person dreams, and the cooperative was closed for the evening with 9 orders waiting on the desk for the morning. And Owen's office had the lamp on low, and the documentation for 2 pending cases on the desk, and Billy Crane eating his supper in the corner. And Ella Dalton Prescott walked the edge of the Kansas prairie with her husband in the September light, and the debt that had brought her here, the fraudulent one, the impossible one and the older one, the one her father had handed to her without asking, and that she had carried for 5 years through grief and stubbornness and misplaced obligation. All of it was gone, not because someone had cleared a ledger, though someone had, not because a contract had been retrieved and burned, though it had, but because she had arrived in a town that bore her father's broken name and she had made it hers on her own terms, and she had built something from the ground up in the honest soil of her own choices, and the debt, every version of it, the financial and the emotional and the inherited and the impossible, was settled. Not by repayment, by release. The debt was never hers to carry. She had always known it somewhere, the way a person knows a thing before they are ready to believe it. She believed it now. The stars came out over Kansas, one at a time and then all at once, and Owen held her hand in the cooling September air, and the prairie was wide and quiet and full of the particular kind of peace that is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of everything that makes difficulty bearable. And Ella pressed her fingers against his, and felt the warm, faithful pressure of his hand in return, and thought that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for a debt that led her to a door that led her to a man who looked up from his desk and saw her entirely and said, "This is not yours to carry," and meant it with everything he had, and proved it every day after. That was the beginning. That, it turned out, was everything.